Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Howell with ZeroNorth. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for today's webcast. We do appreciate the time you're taking to participate today. The topic of the conversation is end-to-end vulnerability and risk management across the enterprise. Over the course of this session, we're going to discuss how digital transformation, compliance, and security are driving new requirements as we think about managing both vulnerabilities and risk. I'm pleased to welcome our speakers. We have John Stephen, who's the CTO at ZeroNorth, and we have Brian McGraw, who's the Global Head of Advisory Services at CyberProof. Before we begin, we do have a couple of housekeeping items. We're going to keep the lines muted during the discussion, but you are welcome to submit questions to the chat box on the right. To offer your question, simply submit it, and we will answer it at the end. Second, if you're unable to stay for the entirety of the webcast, this will be available on demand afterwards, and so you're welcome to listen to it then. And we certainly encourage you to share the link with your colleagues as well. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to John, who will kick off the conversation.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Hi, this is John. So, everybody in attendance is probably aware that software sits at the center of every business, and organizations are now trying to deliver more of what they do as a business through software. And they call this many things, but we'll call it digital transformation. The question is, what does digital transformation entail, and why is it changing the game? Well, there are a few facets of digital transformation that matter. There's a cultural facet of it. People are breaking down the stovepipes of speciality inside of the IT organization through DevOps and making sure that teams organize around delivery of a business application or a value stream. They're trying outsourcing again, but instead of outsourcing offshore, they're outsourcing through cloud service providers and through an increased commitment to open source. There's an architectural component to digital transformation where people are building more and more microservices and building their business around those services and the federation of those services towards value, as opposed to building 1 to 10 monolithic apps. And there are process components where CI/CD and automation are helping people get the slowest portion of software delivery sped up, and the slowest portion, of course, being human intervention. So as IT and as development has become self-service with cloud and other things, these other components of digital transformation, the cadence of delivery has changed. And therefore, the cadence at which we do security and auditing for compliance has to change to keep up. I like to say that in a DevOps world, we've been successful at convincing everybody that security is their responsibility. We've won. However, now that security is everybody's responsibility, if development is self-servicing, if they're moving at a cadence that's faster than audit, the question becomes, how do we, as security professionals, enable them to self-service the compliance and security needs at the speed at which they want to operate?
Hello, everyone. Brian McGraw here. So security and how it impacts the application development teams. As most of you are aware, you've probably heard in the news, as recently in the last 12 months, we've had 50 million users affected by the Newegg breach. We've had 150 million that have been impacted by the Under Armour MyFitnessPal breach. The one thing that a lot of these have in common is that they're coming from applications that are developed in-house. They're coming from websites. They all have this same component where applications are becoming increasingly popular mechanisms of attack. Whether it be SQL injection, broken authentication, and session management, or cross-site scripting, security needs to be an important component of the SDLC. OWASP has done a good job, identifying the top 10 attack vectors in the past, and that's a great place to start, but there are more concerns that have to be accounted for as well. Previously, John mentioned microservices, and one of the things we're seeing with microservices are you're moving faster with shorter development timeframes. Smaller builds equal faster builds and faster deployment. With that sometimes comes increasing complexity. More services oftentimes equates to more databases. It could be multi-cloud. Are you using AWS, Azure? Are you accounting for the user identity and access controls? Are you employing defense and depth? Where does your data end up? Do you have it in multiple databases? Do you have it in an S3 bucket? Hopefully one that's not public. Is it being saved to logs? Is disk caching taking place? So it's really hard to keep track of where all your data is. So therefore, security continues to be one of the top priorities. Then you also have to worry about securing APIs. They're the gateway to your microservice architecture, so making sure that's accounted for. All of this creates added pressure for the in-house application development teams. You now have development professionals needing to be security professionals, and oftentimes that's very difficult to get across to the teams. That's where the ZeroNorth and CyberProof partnership come into play. The ultimate goal for us is to create an end-to-end process for managing this. We help customers integrate an overarching solution where we can go through the process of helping identify vulnerabilities, configuring the platform, customizing it, running scans, prioritizing those vulnerabilities for you, and really just managing the software going forward. Tracking vulnerabilities that exist and creating those compensating controls until remediation is very important for this. And that is really the integration into the managed service that CyberProof is providing, the security expertise around that entire process. So starting on the front end of the SDLC, clear to the end, and really just making sure that the remediation effort is going as planned. And this is all very important because of the complexity of the processes and just the overall impact it has on the organization.
So we talked about digital transformation. We talked about the complexity of the challenge. These two things work hand in glove. Step one for most firms is to understand where the four walls of their business are and what they're responsible for in terms of compliance and in terms of security. With the data center's four walls coming down and people using cloud or software as a service, even inventorying becomes harder. And so as we look at what a CISO's job is in terms of gaining compliance, not only has the job become harder, but the expectation has become more onerous. It's no longer acceptable to say, well, we're going to look at the top 10% of our apps or our top 10 apps in particular and say, that's the scope of our compliance effort. Now firms are being held to the standard of what is the total risk, what is the total surface, and are you compliant across that surface? Again, not just the things that some VP of development is, or a tower lead has been assigned to build, but all of the assets within the responsibility of the enterprise, which again may be operated by a third party as software as a service. And so as we look at what a compliance and then ultimately a broader security initiative entail, these initiatives must work for the software that we're building in-house, that we're buying, or that we're integrating as open source, or that third parties are operating on our behalf, or that third parties are operating in a shared responsibility model like in Amazon. All of these things are going to reflect areas just like the data center did, just like endpoints did, where we have in-scope assets. And so security initiatives are going to need strategies for compliance, which will include, in the case of things like PCI, tactics like vulnerability discovery that work across those dimensions of the business and of software delivery. What was maybe 3 to 5 vulnerability discovery tools in an environment where monolithic apps were deployed in a data center is probably more like 10 vulnerability discovery tools as you combine open source tools to handle some technologies, commercial tools, tools to cover IoT and endpoint devices, and tools to cover things like cloud data, cloud API, configuration checking and things like that. With some firms, we see that they're using as many as 30 vulnerability discovery tools across their enterprise in order to get a singular and accurate picture in each of those different technology environments, in each of those different archetypes of deployment of what the risk faces. And ultimately, that's what we're after. We don't want 10 tools, we don't want 30 tools reports. We want a singular view of what the risk that either a line of business or a business application or a value stream reflects, whether or not that app is built in a very heterogeneous way, or whether it's built in the more legacy monolithic way. So what we see is that firms are looking to software and looking to automation and applying expertise to the challenges of inventorying these more disparate environments and collecting an inventory of what software and infrastructure assets their attack surface reflects, and then selecting the appropriate vulnerability discovery technologies that will give them the compliance picture or the security picture across those assets and the technology stacks. And then using some sort of, whether you call it single pane of glass or dashboard or coherent and unified reporting, to provide a holistic and risk-based view that is both compliance-centered as well as security-centered for the business function or the business exposure that those different technologies aggregated then face. And so those problems of can we inventory, can we cover our technology stacks, though they're disparate, and then can we create a coherent picture of risk based on what we've inventoried, and that coherent picture is what we're looking to talk to in terms of the solution we provide. Brian?
Thanks, John. And with that solution, there's 4 key pieces to that, and those 4 things are assessing, planning, implementing, and operationalizing those things. As John mentioned, digital transformation, we're also trying to transform security, if you will, and really help down that journey with that end-to-end process. Kind of outlined here is kind of a typical engagement, what that would look like, although obviously this would be different per organization. The high-level pieces to this are pretty much the same. There's obviously going to be a discovery phase where we learn about the business, the processes, the softwares involved, the people involved, and really just understanding what that looks like. Getting a feel for the as-is state of the organization, what they're trying to accomplish, and then creating that maturity action plan, which is really focusing on those weaknesses, putting together improvements, whether it be training, whether it be changes in process, whether it be looking at your gate reviews, making sure the proper things are in place with those. And then also updating security controls. That's the biggest piece. But overall, just identifying those weaknesses relating to security. When it comes to the different softwares that the organizations use, there's many different scanning tools. There's many different pieces to that puzzle. Thankfully, ZeroNorth has the capability to ingest results from pretty much any scanning tool that is out there on the market for the most part. It does a good job of bringing those things in and, like John mentioned, putting them into that single pane of glass so you have visibility from different areas of the organization, and really just so you can prioritize the different vulnerabilities that are found. The implementation aspect of that, for CyberProof, we have staff that are trained on the ZeroNorth platform. We can assist with the integration of the software. So we work with the organization from start to finish. We're there as part of the discovery phase. We're there during that, creating the maturity action plan. We're there through that explanation of softwares. And then, of course, we're there to help implement the ZeroNorth platform as well. Lastly, though, and probably the most important thing is the continual management capability that we have. A lot of organizations may want to keep this in-house where they're going to manage their own vulnerabilities, they're going to remediate those, but where we can also step in is to help the client with those things as a managed service, whether it be remediating vulnerabilities or just helping configure different things, creating workflows. We have the ability to do all of that, and we work with ZeroNorth and use their support as needed for complex situations as well. And John, I'll let you explain better the overall ZeroNorth platform.
Yeah, so we know that once we gain an inventory, and we know that once we have a maturity action plan, we're going to struggle with the labor cost and the subject matter expertise required to cover the software and the infrastructure necessary to gain that vulnerability, visibility in order to get, achieve the compliance picture. Our data over the last decade show that, when we adopt tools to attack this problem of, scanning our software and discovering vulnerabilities, that those tools can cost as much as 7 figures if we use the commercial variants instead of the open source. And we know that our customers believe that it costs 1.5 times the license cost to implement those tools, when you begin, and to continue to operate them on an annual basis, and that they find that they're frustrated by the fact that that cost doesn't typically go down over time, that there's always something to do in terms of tuning and triaging and working on accuracy. And so if we know that the maturity action plan is going to tell us that we need to get a handle on that vulnerability detection at scale across those heterogeneous technology sets, and we know that that cost is going to be a limiting factor to our initiative's success, then what we want to do is provide two different kinds of capabilities that help there. The first capability is orchestration, or the onboarding of the vulnerability discovery tools to the native software lifecycles of a firm and the technologies they're using to drive their software lifecycles. And then secondarily, the coherence and correlation of the results that produce that single risk picture from those different tools on the back end. Now, most firms in 2019, have some level of security and quality tools deployed within their engineering organization. Whether or not the security or compliance muscles of the organization are mature and strong, people have thought about quality and thought about security and adopted either some open source or tools here and there. Our objective is to say, if where possible, just pull in the results of those tools that are already being run natively within development groups' life cycles, and reflect that data as part of the compliance and part of the vulnerability discovery visibility picture. Where there are gaps in those tools' capabilities, whether it's infrastructure scanning isn't being done for strong AppSec shops, or infrastructure scanning has been done, but maybe static analysis and composition analysis aren't being done, and those are the PCI compliance gaps, we can always add to the tool regimen and make sure that the total picture is visible by adding whichever tools are the least likely to introduce friction on that technology stack in that life cycle. So you can think of the ZeroNorth platform as a security overlay to the existing software development lifecycle or application lifecycle management process, where this platform works in concert with the existing development or lifecycle toolchain to make sure that those scans or that visibility is provided in band and in a frictionless way, and that a single picture results from those scans. Now, with respect to something like PCI and compliance, you have a very particular view that you would like in terms of which types of tools you want to run to get the visibility, and what type of vulnerabilities or what type of issues those tools report that you want to concentrate on. And so the output from this security visibility layer can be filtered to make sure that that's the compliance picture your developers are focusing on the remediation of those issues that are going to affect compliance. And that's in essence the risk-based approach here. As a firm matures beyond simply a compliance view of things, they can choose whatever kind of risk tolerance they want to augment what kind of filtration they want, and pay attention to different criticalities, different kinds of bug types that maybe the compliance regimen is not mandating they look at. For some firms, they have standardized around technologies like containers and use Docker, and those specific technologies inside a lifecycle act as great choke points where you can, at that container registry or at the container construction time, hook a lot of these vulnerability discovery activities. In other firms, there's a bit of a sort of custom meat grinder that generates the software with many different CI and CD technologies brought to bear before both the mobile app and the backing services are ultimately delivered. And so in each organization, what we seek to do is find 3 to 5 kind of template software lifecycles that are backed by a similar number of template lifecycle technology solution architectures, and say for the pieces of the business that are building mobile apps backed by services, this is going to be an effective security overlay to your build chains. For the business units that are containerizing and pushing a legacy server only app to the cloud, this is going to be an effective security overlay, and so on and so on. By creating those solution architectures and packaging those, what you're able to do on platform is dramatically reduce the time it takes you to onboard each business unit or development team, to security visibility and ultimately to compliance.
So with the overall integrated solution, one of the most important aspects to consider is moving security front and center during software development. A few of the reasons why that's highly important is more secure software really tackles the continuous concern of overall security. You're doing that at the front of the project rather than at the end. It also brings more awareness of security considerations to key stakeholders. With a solution like this, you not only have something you can present to people on your team or other teams, but you could even gather metrics that you could present to a board and show continuous improvement along the way. Next, I guess, early detection of flaws in a system. Rather than finding these things out so far down the life cycle, you're actually doing this early on, which also leads to cost reduction because of that early detection. The later a vulnerability is detected, the more costly it becomes to fix it. You oftentimes have to start over processes, go through change procedures, all of that. So finding these things sooner in that life cycle is going to keep the cost down and also improve the efficiencies. And then many vulnerabilities detected in a release phase could have been detected prior. That's just kind of a commonly known statistic. But overall, you're reducing the overall business risk for the organization. delivering complete visibility into vulnerabilities and risk is the overall key. And to do this, and where ZeroNorth and CyberProof are really providing value is around the automation and orchestration of this. Oftentimes, when you hear security being implemented, you think less efficient. You think taking longer to get things done. And I think the unique ability for ZeroNorth and CyberProof to provide a solution that doesn't add to that is really a great thing. You have the ZeroNorth tool that is correlating results from disparate scanning tools. You're able to filter out false positives or change the criticality based on your business need. All of that helps paint a better picture for your organization. On the back end of that, with CyberProof, we have the CyberProof Defense Center that if we wanted to, we could feed the results from ZeroNorth into that platform, do some automation and orchestration as well, have AI kicking off that's doing different workflows, tasks based on alerts and notifications, and really just adding to the overall monitoring, creating those compensating controls, and getting to remediation in a much quicker way. And I think overall, that's the ultimate goal, is to take as much off the hands of the individuals, create that automation, orchestration, while keeping costs at a minimum.
All right, well, Brian and John, thank you both so much for the time. We do have a few minutes left for questions, and a couple have come in over the chat, so we'll just launch into those. Remember, if you were interested in asking a question to either of the presenters or to both of them, simply submit your question on the chat screen on the right-hand side. John, the first question is, does ZeroNorth provide the users the probability of an exploit being created against the identified vulnerabilities? Can you speak to that one, please?
Sure. So the platform, out of the box, one of the first things it does to any vulnerability discovery data that comes into it is we try to CVSS normalize the scoring that comes out of the individual tools. Some tools already support CVSS version 3 scoring, others do not. And so we feel like, normalizing that scoring is important to that coherent picture. If you're a firm that uses a lot of different kinds of tools, you realize, day one that, they output apples, pears, peaches, and cars, and those things need to be normalized in order to get that single picture. Once we normalize the score, we will flesh out that the scoring attributes with whatever other data that we can correlate from other tools that are run. Right now, we don't support any scoring based on threat intelligence feeds, but we do intend to do that later this summer. One of the challenges in doing that, there are firms that say they do that, is that many times the attributes that come out of the threat intelligence platforms don't intrinsically, in a strong way, that we can correlate with the things that come out of, say, static or dynamic analysis tools. And so we haven't, to this point, prioritized that. You do have the opportunity on our platform to run Metasploit, which is one of the tools we support use of on platform. And so you can use that to give yourself a better indication of the probability of vulnerabilities that other tools detect on platform.
All right.
Good question, though.
All right, so the next question I'm going to toss over to you, Brian. The question has to do with PCI, and the question is, are there different ways to handle PCI compliance, or is the path pretty well specified by the regulations and organizations just have to deal with it as it is?
A little bit of both. With PCI, there are definitely identified requirements that need to be met. With those requirements, there's also subcategories and sub-requirements, I think to the tune of like 250 that should be met. But how you get there is really the ultimate question, and that really is dependent on the organization as a whole. Going back to those breaches that I mentioned earlier, the Under Armour, you have Home Depot, Newegg, Target, all of those, they all come back to a critical piece of the PCI requirement, which is in 6.3, which is saying that you have to develop software and applications in accordance with the PCI standard based on best practices, and then incorporate those throughout the software development lifecycle. An example that I'll give is that you can have a PCI compliant application but not be PCI compliant. If you move this application to a PCI compliant web host, the question would be, do you still need to be compliant? And the answer is yes, you do, because simply outsourcing some or all of the organizational functions does not mean you don't still have to comply with PCI. There's organizational, procedural, documentational controls which still have to be met. So for example, using that, if you did move your application to a hosting service that was PCI compliant, you still need to ensure the organization appoints someone to handle the PCI compliance program. You would still need to conduct a risk assessment. You'd still need to document controls used either in your own organization or by the hosted organization. And you'd still have to have a secure SDLC. Those processes would still need to be in place, and you would still need to perform penetration testing, vulnerability scanning against those applications.
All right, Brian, thank you. We have another question that's come in. John, I'll toss this to you. In the case of a SOC using the integrated platform, what are the three main ways in which a SOC analyst can use the integrated ZeroNorth CyberProof platform solution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, right now correlation platforms, typically don't support SOC analysts as first-class citizens, at least not to the extent that like a SOAR platform does. But there are tremendous ways that one can get benefit from these platforms as a SOC analyst. So first, anything that emits machine-readable events, whether it's your MSSP or something like a JASK or a Splunk, whatever, we can begin to support on our platform in hours. In fact, customers can self-service or through field engineering, we can add adapters in well-tested and scalable adapters. We say in a week. But you can self-service and be online in an hour or two. Once you do that self-service integration and that's supported through REST APIs, through webhooks, or through the orchestration primitives the platform provides. So there's a lot of different integration widgets that allow you to sort of meet on your side of the river of how your technologies work. And then when you create that translation layer that allows you to import the events or the findings, those are going to automatically correlate based on the key metadata that's therein with the other vulnerability data on our platform. Because the platform organizes things by targets, and targets can be infrastructure or they can be build-related or code-related, and then targets accreting to applications. Either architecturally, these three targets are reflective of components of this application, or temporally, these targets represent this application as it flows through its life cycle into production. SOC analysts can then use those correlated events with the other vulnerability discovery data to help them figure out which developers, which builds, which containers need to be incorporated into the response process. So the platform is going to help them understand how to engage dev along with their ops function in order to respond to something. And then ultimately, not only to respond to it from a Band-Aid perspective, but also respond to it from the perspective of how do we proactively make sure that the next time that the software is released, it does not reflect these vulnerabilities. And so I'd say that the first way is they can quickly either self-service or use our field to ingest that event data. They can use the ingested and correlated data to engage the right, again, software pipelines, teams, and artifact owners to, operationally respond to issues and then proactively fix them. And then over time, you know, we will support more of the, you know, the kind of operational playbooks associated with those events, like SOAR does, inside the platform. So hopefully that's a helpful answer there, but good question.
And John, one thing I'll add to that is on the CyberProof side, the value that, and I guess the most important aspect for us is really that holistic monitoring. If we're pulling in results from your SIM into the CyberProof Defense Center, that's one mechanism of reporting. If we're pulling in those results from ZeroNorth as well, that's another mechanism for reporting. We can take sources, different sources, and be that SOC and prioritize remediation events. And really it goes back to the automation effort where ZeroNorth is doing its own automation. The CyberProof Defense Center can also do some automation and be that kind of first level of SOC. You can create rules or workflows based on different events that could be triggered from ZeroNorth or from a SIM or any other tool. And I think that's, you know, the additional value that we're providing and really how we're hitting that end-to-end solution with further automation.
Right. Thank you both. A couple more before we wrap. So Brian, I'm going to toss this one over to you as well. It's compliance related. The question is, how should I estimate compliance will slow my development efforts? So what is the impact of compliance on development?
Yeah, this is a really good question because I kind of touched on this earlier when I mentioned that normally security does not improve efficiency, and people oftentimes just hate to hear that. But to answer the question, it's difficult to say at times because it depends on the compliance effort, the gaps in the process, and many different variables throughout the project. One of the tenets of the shift left concept, which focuses on getting developers involved in testing early in the process, is to bring compliance and security as close to the left of that development lifecycle. To help ensure, you know, clean quality code before a developer submits it to a version control system. That will help minimize introduction of vulnerabilities into an application. One way to accomplish this without creating additional burden is with automated static code analysis, which is, you know, running checks on the code before it's created to ensure compliance. And then that will also help detect security flaws, design defects, or just overall code weaknesses. And then this will help with identifying and recommending fixes earlier in the delivery process, even before they're exposed to the public oftentimes. And that's a good example of just how automation around software development can improve overall quality control without the manual intervention, and in turn slowing down the project. So including compliance and security personnel and practices at the beginning of the project, hopefully will help avoid some of the slowdowns that you would typically see, but also account for the risk management needs. And this kind of goes full circle back to what I was talking about before with, again, that end-to-end solution where you're identifying the risks and their triggers, you're classifying and prioritizing those, but you're also drafting that maturity action plan that links, you know, the next steps to improve your overall security footprint. You're doing continuous monitoring to look for those triggers during the project, and then implementing that mitigating control if it's required. And then, of course, lastly is just the communication effort, having that visibility into the different sources really helps to make sure that you're not, you know, getting stuck in that vicious cycle of slowdown that we're trying to avoid.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Brian. So one more question, the final one, John, I'm going to put it towards you. The question is about sort of the volume or number of vulnerability tools needed. So how many tools are needed in-house in order to get the most out of this solution? So what do you need in order for this to be successful?
Yeah, so I began to speak about this earlier. People sometimes wonder, about the small end and the large end, right? So there are firms that are really only relying on maybe one or two vulnerability discovery tools. Maybe they're doing some infrastructure scanning. Maybe they're doing some penetration testing on a manual basis. So do I get benefits out of an orchestration solution when that's the case for my organization? I think the answer begins to be yes in those cases, even there, because you commonly find different kinds of applications, different kinds of technologies hidden within the organization that cause you to augment that one or two tools with maybe ancillary open source or your own custom scripts and your own custom checkers. And being able to glue those, like the answer to the SOC question, into a platform and get a single report that looks the same and that participates with the software lifecycle and toolchain software the same way is valuable, even when there's one or two tools. When one counts the individual efforts of security champions or security practitioners inside the firm, they'll find that those little widgets that those people write end up making sort of the minimum number of tools people use 3 to 5 anyways. I mentioned earlier in the call that some people are using as many as 30 tools, and so in those cases, or when you're using infrastructure scanning tools, the concern is in a different direction. It's scale. And so you want to make sure that the solution you're using is going to scale to hundreds of thousands of scans per week on an automated basis with potentially hundreds of millions of vulnerabilities that you can correlate and cut down to those 10 or those 100 that your firm needs to really address immediately in each case and on that ongoing basis. And so, looking at the technology's ability to, one, quickly be field serviceable to bring on board those 3 to 5 tools that you're using, maybe that you've home rolled, but that solution is still going to work for you when you're using Tenable at scale or those other infrastructure tools, to me is valuable. We've found in both the BSIM study and the compendium DevOps studies we've been doing recently that many firms within the population have either adopted a commercial version of a correlation and an orchestration tool, or many more firms have built their own because they didn't see one and because they needed this capability. So I think I think this is something that firms are seeing sort of an immediate need for and immediate value from.
Thank you, John. All right, so I think at this point we're going to wrap up. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who took 45 minutes out of their day to join this webcast. We greatly appreciate it. Huge thank you to Brian and John for taking the time. Quick reminder that there are attachments available if you'd like to learn more about our solutions or capabilities from either ZeroNorth and or CyberProof. This will be available on demand if you have colleagues who are interested in it. And then finally, you can certainly find more information by visiting our websites, which are on the screen, or by following us on our respective Twitter handles. So thank you again, and we'll look forward to a future webcast.
Thank you.